Hello, everyone. This is Carter Wetzel with another episode of Into the Interchain. Today's guest is Sid from Comdex. We go back a long way, so super pumped to just talk about all things Cosmos, all things IBC, all things Comdex and DeFi. So, Sid, who are you? What are you about? And what is Comdex solving?
Thanks, Carter, for having me. Hey, everyone. I'm Sid, one of the co-founders of Comdex. Comdex is a DeFi infrastructure layer for Cosmos. So essentially, it's a all-in-one DeFi chain that's built, for Cosmos. Kind of started my journey, working in traditional finance. Spent a lot of time working across different roles there. Really got interested in what crypto was in 2017, and then kind of learned more and more about that, and always felt like it's always been a bit about DeFi, and that's what kind of drove me towards working and building in the Cosmos ecosystem and building Comdex.
Amazing. And when you think about Comdex versus other DeFi protocols that are out there, what really differentiates Comdex in your mind?
So when I kind of look at at least when I talk about Cosmos and the DeFi landscape there, there's definitely a lot of individual app chains that solve individual use cases. For Dexes, there's Osmosis, there's Crescent for lending borrowing, there's Umi. For stablecoin, there's now, there wasn't for the longest time any stablecoin. There was UST, which we saw how it turned out. But since then, there's been, Comdex, there's Shade, Silk from Shade, there's USK from Kujira, and then IST from Interprotocol. So in terms of kind of the current landscape, it's scattered across different app chains. Our approach is to have a singular chain that has all of these different DeFi utilities built out there, and then to have kind of all these competing interests of different apps sit on top of a single chain would allows that chain to be governed and driven in such a way that all these apps kind of work synergistically in the long run. So sort of like what Terra was, but with a sustainable stablecoin at the middle of it, and kind of like less Ponzi-nomics in the overall token design of how things operate.
So we've talked about kind of the role, briefly that UST was a large part of the Cosmos, and since then there's been, three or four stablecoin projects that have popped up to fill the void. What do you think was the biggest lesson learned from the Terra community as a whole, as well as what happened with UST? Like as a DeFi builder, as a protocol builder, um, what were the takeaways?
So personally, for me, where we came from, at least when I talk about like the origins of Comdex, we were doing a lot of things on the CFI side of things, where we were building products that cater to institutional clients and institutional user bases. We always envisioned, payments and financing or solutions being on chain as kind of a big part of what needs to happen, and that's what drove us towards building our own infrastructure stack that facilitates that. So along that journey, we did realize the need for a stablecoin that would power a lot of the solutions that we are ultimately planning to build out. And long before the collapse of USD, when we did come to the realization that there needs to be a stablecoin, it has to be decentralized in the way it's governed and operates, but it will power payments for everything that we build. That's when we kind of, that's where personally I spent a lot of time studying, all the past models of the stablecoin. And I think I think it had been like 2 months or 3 months where I'd studied a lot of these things, and that's when I met you for the first time. And I remember we had a very long chat about different stablecoin models and what the pros and cons of different things are. But it always seemed clear to me that having an over collateralized stablecoin like what MakerDAO has done, on the Ethereum side of things, is surely kind of the long term, more robust and sustainable model that needs to be built. And that's kind of what drove our decision the entire time, even before USD collapsed. Of course, when USD did start falling, we saw the hypotheses play out in real time. Where USD collapsed, it kind of took the whole Terra ecosystem down with it because everything was so dependent on USD. So, major takeaway from that has to be that when you look at any DeFi ecosystem, whether it's in Ethereum or any other layer one for that matter, whatever stablecoin powers the majority of that ecosystem actually, holds kind of a lot of the power for how DeFi as a whole plays out there. And to focus on a sustainable model for that stablecoin becomes kind of quintessential for everything else DeFi that's happening there. So same kind of lesson that we learned is, whatever stablecoin, I think that are being built across the ecosystem right now have kind of picked up the same lesson from that. And I think it's healthier for the overall ecosystem that there's competing stablecoins, but all with the same ethos and ideology with how they build.
Do you think algorithmic stablecoin that isn't, greater than 110% collateralized possible, like the vision of Frax as a fractionalized stablecoin that hovers somewhere from 95 to 100%. Do you think there's a room for more capital efficient stables, or do you believe that this over collateralized model within this programmatic environment is really the only thing that can ever fully be trusted?
Um, I think when you look back at how traditional finance operates for the most part, because that's finance that has existed for decades and centuries. Across the board, I think the prevailing model is over collateralization, because when you talk about the collateral asset set, it's typically volatile collateral assets that have values that can fluctuate over time. When you think of currency, all currency exists as debt in some form. Same way, some stable coins exist as debt.
Yep.
So solvency of debt kind of becomes key part of how systems remain sustainable, and the only way to kind of ensure that sustainability is by over collateralizing. Now again, how much to over collateralize by becomes a function of liquidity of the collateral asset, the
Yep.
volatility of the collateral asset, and several other factors. Do I believe an algorithmic stablecoin or something along those lines can exist? I think it can, to be honest, because when you look at Terra itself, when you look at UST itself, it did reach whatever number it did reach. To some extent, it was more a failure of mechanism rather than anything else. A lot of people call it a scam or a fraud. I tend to say it wasn't a scam or a fraud. It was a mechanism that failed. And every mechanism is kind of an economic experiment, and experiments can fail. So to that regard, sometimes when I think about the way US dollar exists, at times right now, it's kind of an algorithmic stablecoin itself, uh, but it works. So it works as long as there's faith in the system, but faith is kind of a fickle parameter to base your entire kind of economy on, which is why I think over collateralization has always kind of prevailed in traditional finance, and it should prevail in the decentralized world as well.
It's interesting because if you think about over collateralization, the stability of the system is only as good as the faith in the assets that are being over collateralized. So it's at the end of the day, it's like value is such a fickle thing. Like the volatility will always prevail, and so every system that involves people holding like valuing items has a degree of trust involved that will never fully be able to be removed. But what you can do is try to select things that have shown to have a lot of trust, and you can choose collateralization ratios to give the system the time to be able to handle shocks and volatility. But I think you and I had a conversation with someone at at Masari, and it was someone I'm not going to give his name, but essentially what he pointed out is these like no system is immune. Like every currency is attackable, no matter what model you use. And he kind of went after the over collateralized model and said like, hey, like there's still risks with the liquidity there. If it like there's been examples with sovereign currencies being attacked, and like they went through the same thing that an over collateralized stablecoin might if the right threat actor goes after it. So it's just all you can do is put in these preventions and these parameters, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be risk, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there can be currency, and there can be stable currency. Currency, if you look at something like BTC is currency, and in
Yeah.
that sense, you couldn't really attack BTC. But stable currency, when you think about
Yep.
any kind of stable coin, because you're building in the condition of stability into it, it also comes with its own set of risks.
Yep.
Of course, I mean, risk is inevitable. You can only minimize it, but you can't eliminate it.
Yeah. The promise of stability is such a strong attribute, and there's so much demand for that attribute. But there's a reason it's difficult, right? There's a reason that there's not thousands of stable assets out there. I mean, there really is no truly stable asset. There is everything's trading in relation to everything else, and there's always fluctuations in people's like where they put their value, where they put their trust. So, but Web3 needs it. We need stability so badly. And it seems to be, I think it's over 88% of stablecoins in Web3 are centralized stablecoins. So maybe Sid, it's a chance to like talk about the value of self custodianship, maybe your thoughts on what's happening with like FTX and what the role of a stablecoin, like why decentralized stablecoins are so important.
Yeah, I mean, the events have been over the past week have just been insane. Keeping a track of everything has been crazy. But it's at the heart of it all is a big lesson for everyone who's in this space, is that not your keys, not your assets, essentially. When we talk about custodianship itself, looking at centralized stablecoins, there's USDT and USDC being the most popular examples. The way they're essentially backed is by having fiat deposits or the equivalent in other assets, but that are ultimately custodied by a single entity. Um, and then for us to have trust in the system, to know that there's sufficient asset backing all the stable that exists, we rely on more centralized entities like auditors and audit firms to create those audit reports. And the more you kind of trace the system down, it's centralization of trust at every step along the way, which um, which is overall a vulnerable system when you think about kind of how much power lies in the hands of such few people who have competing interests with what they're actually working towards. Uh, and I think that's kind of the theme of what we saw with the FTX situation as well. It's relying on folks to declare their sheets or their balance sheets, but it's also not in their interest to kind of be honest about
Right.
what their balance sheets truly hold. So in that regard, it strengthens the message of decentralization and what we all work for as builders in Web3 and in this realm of decentralization. It all started with the idea that your assets are your assets. You should be able to custody them, and you should be provably able to custody them, and no one can simply take them away from you if they wanted to. You look at USDC, USDT, they reserve the right to blacklist wallet addresses based on whatever sanctions and whatever kind of conditions, regulations imposed on them. Uh, in all of that, there is always a room for decentralized money, decentralized assets that when you custody them, they're yours. As long as you hold the keys for them, they're yours. And I think that's kind of the powerful thing about what we're all building. Um, Not just stable coins. You just talk about any on-chain asset. As long as you're able to custody it yourself, it's yours. And I mean, I feel like a broken record saying this, but it's a very powerful message. When you see the CFIs of the world collapse, you see Celsius's and Voyagers and
Yep.
FTX's collapse. To me, it just strengthens my conviction in the work that we're all doing and what we're building. And I think it's all positive as long as bad actors keep getting weeded out of the system.
As a builder, my conviction's at an all-time high. But then I look at consumers and their conviction's at an all-time low. So where do you think that disparity comes from? We have these currencies on the horizon that have these strong attributes and promises that centralized finance can never be able to give by nature of its design and its mechanisms. So why do you think that gap exists?
Because I think when you look at consumers, the majority of them are still, quote unquote, retail, which is, speculative audiences who come for, the speculative value of what crypto has to offer. And of course, when events like these unfold, people lose money. A lot of people have lost, tremendous amounts of money. Sometimes their entire life savings have been lost, and that can, of course, discourage people, away from this whole ecosystem and away from what we're building. Um, I think two parts of kind of getting over this. One is obviously education. Um, Today, when users use applications, they don't really care what's happening at the back end. They're more concerned with I press this button, the outcome should be X. From X, I can do Y,
Yep.
and I'm happy. I don't ask any more questions than that. So, part one is getting them to ask what happens at the back end when they do certain things, how it's all working. And part two is also the UX itself, where I always say the kind of parameter I use for assessing Web3 UX today is how easy is it for my dad or my granddad to set up a MetaMask and start using crypto. And as things are today, whether it's MetaMask or Kepler, I don't think we're at that point today where confidently I could say, the average 50-year-old or 60-year-old in the world is able to confidently use these systems. So when we kind of overcome these hurdles of UX and education, then consumers start making that choice. I think there was an interesting podcast I was hearing the other day where the subject was, should regulations now enforce centralized exchanges to publish proof of reserves?
Oh,
And
interesting.
And the counterpoint that someone made was, why wait for regulations to do it? Why not educate the consumers in such a way that they only choose centralized exchanges that do publish proof of reserves? And that's kind of like a consumer enforced regulation on the system. And that made sense to me, where I feel like when users start asking the questions about what what custodying your assets on chain truly means, then they'll automatically gravitate towards solutions that are offering them that, rather than the centralized counterparts that have room for things to be messed up in so many different ways.
The ultimate form of regulation is where people put their money. Like it's the ultimate vote. It's the vote of value. Like I go and work in some form of labor market. I accrue representations of the work that I did, and like where I put that is it's a vote. It's a weight. So I think if people withdraw from centralized exchanges that don't have proof of reserves and they put the ones that do have proof of reserves, that is the ultimate type of regulation. It's commerce deciding what's trusted and what's not. What's a quality product, what's not a quality product. And regulations exist to set those standards when I think when consumers don't necessarily know any better. So on this specific topic, it's like I agree. Ideal scenario is consumers are educated enough to go and do the right thing. The question is there too much risk that consumers won't know how to make that right decision? So I'm a pretty like not big regulation individual, but when I think about regulation, it's about in people who have a lot of power being forced to follow a set of parameters that protects consumers that consumers don't even know they're being protected about. It's a very slippery slope. There's a lot of slippery slope tied to regulations. And in my opinion, I'm happy with like regulation of centralized exchanges up to the centralized standard. Um, I think that's the play that whenever there's centralized parties, I think that's where the regulation should be, and that's the beauty of DeFi though, is it regulates itself. The code regulates everyone, right? That is the promise. We don't need those regulations because it exists in the code and it's open source and people can audit it. Um, so yeah, those are some of my thoughts on the regulatory front. The one thing I did hear about was exchanges in the US were fine during everything that happened, which does kind of speak to the fact that those regulations work. But to your point, none of the consumers are choosing US exchanges. They're choosing Binance and FTX International because the regulations are so strict and there's way less utility and stuff that you can actually do on the US exchanges. So that's the counterpoint to my counterpoint is like you add in you start adding in more and more regulation to protect people, but then the product's worse. So how do you find the balance? And that's ultimately why I'm not a regulator, I'm a builder.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the thing is, regulations are designed to protect the end user, the end customer who doesn't know who doesn't know better. So in that regard, if truly followed for what they're built for, they're actually good. But the problem is the moment you put regulations into the picture, uh, and there's humans that are involved in terms of enforcing it, the kind of payoff matrix for a single individual in that in that chain who's on the enforcing side of regulation, the kind of payoff you can get from the position of power you hold by
Right.
abusing your position is so much higher than just being honest and doing your honest job, that you almost trust that that person has to be a good person for this thing to work.
Huh.
And more often than not, we've seen that you know power corrupts. So it's more a matter of time, where regulations might work smoothly for some time, where it just takes for one bad actor to enter the system, get that power to enforce regulation, and use it for their own benefit rather than for the greater good. And that's kind of the flip side of regulations, where uh, I think that's kind of that flip side is the decentralized part of it, where you take away this power from the individual. Code is law, and everything is governed by code. And if you're not with the code, you're not in the system.
The analogy that came to my head is like whenever we talk about centralized finance, we always say who watches the watcher, right?
Yeah.
Who watches the SEC? Like who watches the commodities like CMST? Like there's so many different organizations and who watches the watcher. But in crypto, who watches the watcher? Well, it's like the watcher is the smart contract, right? Who watches the watcher? It's open source. It's everyone. Everyone's the watcher. Everyone has the ability to like well, I guess not everyone. Everyone with the skill set to be able to audit and be able to check these things and disperse information out. Um, but I think that maybe is what you've identified as one of the revolutions is the problem of who watches the watcher in centralized finance. There's never going to be a solution to it because it's a hierarchy. But with smart contracts, everything's flattened out and everyone can watch the watcher. Everyone can check out the open source code and make sure that things are functioning as they say they're supposed to function. And that's the democratization of programmatic regulation, something on the lines of that. And like, what a powerful concept.
Absolutely. And kind of going back to the point earlier where um, today we're in a position where we want centralized exchanges to publish the proof of reserves. It's still something they have to do themselves. You go to something like MakerDAO, with the platform that they have, anyone can just go and look at the chain and see how much collateral exists today,
Yep.
and just know that the proof of reserve is on the chain. It's public. It's real time. And there's no screwing around with it. It can be proven that everything that's there is actually true.
Right.
So that just kind of levels the playing field for everyone.
So we've kind of talked about stablecoins a little bit, the environment, talked about FTX, the regulation side of things. Let's shift over to Comdex and specifically the layer one and the engineering challenges that Comdex is facing. I know we had a Twitter space before, so if anyone who wants to check it out, I will link that in the description below. We had a very at length conversation about Comdex, its products, its apps, the lending side, the stablecoin side. So today, as we kind of head towards the end of this, let's have a brief conversation about the engineering challenges on the layer one side of things and where you see Comdex fitting into IBC, the world of cross-chain smart contract calls, and interchain security, any of those types of Cosmos buzzwords that we're all looking forward to becoming real.
For sure. I mean, I kind of always felt this where building DeFi is probably one of the most challenging things to do out there. And not taking credit away from people who build other things, but this is just my kind of biased perspective of building DeFi. Because ultimately, what you're doing is building a product where people are going to put their money in. People put their savings into it, and a lot of times they put all of their trust into what you build. So on the building side of things, it becomes kind of our responsibility to ensure that no stone is left unturned when it comes to making sure things work. Things are in a way that they can't be exploited, and in a way that they can't be gamed. Um, and that responsibility itself, I would say, is the biggest challenge when it comes to building DeFi. For us, we've gone through several iterations. When it comes to the model, like when you think about the stablecoin model, we spent months just learning different models, figuring out what happens, and different ways that bad actors could come into the system and exploit it, until we arrived at what we think is the right model. That solves one part of the problem, but there's several other parts of it where you plan it out, you have a vision for how it's going to look like and how users will use it, but then comes the part of actually building it. That brings with it a whole set of challenges of its own. I'm sure, like on the engineering side, there's of course getting the smart contracts, getting audits done. There's a lot of back and forth with the auditors where they come back to you with certain comments, you address those. A lot of times you fix one thing, you get over the line on that one thing, but it kind of opens two new things that you need to address.
Yep.
You fix them both, and they branch out into four new things. So it's a long iterative process, and a lot of times it opens up so many different things that you need to address at once. But it also is a challenge to kind of stay progressing on the timeline of what you're trying to achieve. I think for us personally, one of the challenges has been, I would say, frankly, it has been that where we were fairly smooth in coming to a consensus as a team about what the product is going to be, what it's going to look like, what mechanism it's going to follow. But as soon as we got into the building process is actually where the real, I would say, hard work began. And when you kind of keep reminding yourself of the responsibility that comes with building DeFi, I mean, hearing the stories of what happened to folks who had a lot of money invested in Anchor, and kind of the impact it had on their lives when the Terra ecosystem collapsed, it's just scary to think about. What could potentially happen if that happened again. So I think it's just kind of double checking yourself, triple checking yourself, making sure what you've done is right, and that's the biggest challenge. But once you kind of get over the line with that, there's a lot more to be done. Of course, building everything out. I mean, this is something Abhishek, my co-founder, told me the other day. Is like, till you launch, launching is your biggest problem, but once you launch, there's going to be 100 other problems that you have to deal with as well.
Yep.
So for us right now, launch is the only focus. But I know that once we launch, there's going to be 20 other things that's going to get onto my plate that I'm going to have to solve. And I'm all up for it because I think ultimately we're all solving a big picture challenge, and it's kind of necessary for the overall ecosystem, and it's also a very rewarding process to do this.
I always like to say that the starting line, the finish line is the starting line. There's never
Yeah,
ever like
yeah.
it feels like, oh, we just got, but then it's just the beginning. So it's the never ending challenge of development. Um, well, I super happy to have had you on here, Sid. If you have any closing remarks, how we can join the Comdex community, would love to just point people your direction. And thank you so much for being on Into the Interchain.
Oh, for sure. Thanks for having me. It was great. Always great chatting with you. For those who are listening, getting involved in the Comdex community is quite simple. I think you can make your way to the website, which is comdex.one. From there, you should be able to find the Twitter and the Telegram and Discord quite easily. Usually, I spend most of my time on Twitter and Telegram. So if you want to reach out to myself or a lot of the folks on the team, that those are the two best spaces to do that. There's also a bunch of folks on the engineering side who spend a lot of time on the Discord. That's where you could reach out with more there. But yeah, plenty of announcements coming. I know. I think I'm not sure when this would go live, but we're pretty close to the stablecoin launch. I'm expecting it to be tomorrow. So hopefully by the time this is live, users will be ready to interact with Harbor Protocol and start minting CMST. There is an airdrop that's happening for Harbor, which we're kind of doing Cosmos wide because we believe CMST is eventually going to have a lot of touch points across Cosmos. And yeah, just stay updated for everything that's going on. There's always going to be announcements coming post launch. We plan to do a lot of partnerships and a lot of kind of interesting integrations that we think will help enhance the utility of what we're building. So yeah, just stay tuned is the message.
Amazing, and also by the time this goes out, the stablecoin summit will be announced too. So be sure to tune into that December 20th. A bunch of really cool protocols across the cosmos coming together to talk all things DeFi and stablecoins. So thank you, everyone. That was Into the Interchain with Sid from Comdex. Hope you all have a wonderful day.